Hello everyone, my name is Marie Karekla and welcome to today's AIRAH Streamline session. I hope everyone's been keeping well and having a good week so far. So today's webinar is on the 2025 National Packaging Targets and it's presented to you today by APCO. Just before I hand you over to our presenter, if you do have any questions, just a reminder to please put them in the Q&A box, and then we'll try and get through as many questions as possible after the formal presentation. So I'd now like to introduce to you our presenter, Jayne Paramor, who is the Sustainability Manager at APCO. So Jayne, I will pass things over to you to get the presentation underway.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for the opportunity to come and talk to you today. As Marie said, my name is Jayne Paramor. I am Sustainability Manager here at the Australian Packaging Covenant Organisation, and I wanted to talk you through a little bit about who we are, what we do in the packaging sustainability space, how we fit within the Australian regulatory frameworks around packaging materials and waste, and how we're tracking towards the 2025 national packaging targets, which are underpinning our work and a lot of the work that we're doing right across the packaging landscape in Australia at the moment. Just before we get underway, I would of course like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work, and encourage everybody else to do the same. I reside and work on the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation here in Sydney, and I live in Aboriginal heartland in Redfern, so I'm daily surrounded by our First Nations cultures and very much enriched by that experience, and feel that we have a great deal to learn from our First Nations communities, just in terms of a lot of the stewardship and environmental management that we need to be doing with some of these challenges, such as packaging and plastics and waste in those areas. So welcome those voices to the discussion, and pay my respects to the traditional elders past, present and emerging, and welcome you today. So ladies and gentlemen, folks, I really just want to cover off a few things today. We've got about half an hour to talk through some of these points. The first thing that I want to really cover is what we know as the National Environment Protection Measure, or because we all like acronyms, we call it the NEPM, for used packaging materials, which establishes the regulatory landscape for used materials in the Australian marketplace, what the role of APCO is within that framework, and the collective impact model that we use. And I just want to take you through where we're up to with the packaging targets, a bit of background on the establishment of those and how we're tracking towards the objectives that have been outlined there, and also just a little bit about the kind of packaging innovation, thinking about what your packaging is and how to start, I guess, evaluating and moving in the right direction to improve the sustainability of your packaging, but also the circularity of the materials that are being put into the marketplace to make sure that they're being retained at their highest level for as long as possible. So to get into the conversation, I'll start with our regulatory framework and what APCO is. A lot of people think APCO is actually an industry association. We're not quite. We're something a little bit different, but I'll hopefully be able to explain that a little bit more as we go through today. So just in terms of the broader global framework around packaging waste, sustainability issues in this space are very much guided, in that global framework around the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And as you can see on screen there, the work that we do in packaging circularity and sustainability is actually contributing to a significant number of those goals in various different ways. So the impacts that we have really are driving a very strong agenda in terms of that broader sustainability and sustainable development approach to the way our future should be looking, really. So we tie closely into that, and we work certainly through that lens in terms of the approach that we take, also to understand a little bit more about how we're tracking in a global context. In many ways, Australia is very advanced in this space. We've had good recycling infrastructure in place for a long time, but there are a number of challenges that we still face. But certainly within that lens, we crystallise a lot of the work that we do. In the Australian context, slightly different scenarios. I seem to have lost my mouse, so bear with me one moment while I move myself forward there. Hang on one second, I do seem to have lost my mouse there. Where's that gone? There we are, coming back into play there. One second. No, that's not going where I thought it was going. What's happened there?
Maybe, Jayne, maybe it might be try using the arrow key on your keyboard, perhaps? Maybe?
Yeah, I just did, Marie, and there it is. I've just found it again. Right, I can see.
Perfect.
Now I'm on two screens, so it's moved off onto the other screen, and I couldn't work out which way to bring it back.
Good.
Anyway,
Thanks, Jayne.
Got it. Thank you, Marie. So in the national context, we are very much governed by the National Waste Policy, which was brought out in 2019. Under that policy action plan, we as an organisation have been charged with a number of areas that we need to focus on, particularly relevant to the plastics and packaging space. So that is probably the highest level in terms of our national approach to these issues. More recently, many of you may be aware that the National Plastics Plan itself was actually produced at the beginning of 2021. And again, building on that national waste policy and the action plan that came out of that, a number of elements were outlined in the plastics plan specifically to address some of the challenges that we're facing around plastic packaging and the waste that's associated with the use of those materials. We've seen that the government has implemented a number of export bans on materials that are problematic, predominantly based on the limitations that we were suddenly encountering in the wake of things like the China sword policy in terms of our export, our capacity to export waste offshore for processing. So in that area, there were 4 areas that were particularly focused on. We looked at plastics, we looked at glass, we looked at fibre, and we looked at tyres, or at least the government did. And they realised that these were some of the more challenging materials in terms of the waste that was being generated. So we decided, or the government decided, that they would actually implement bans to try and prompt a level of capacity building at home by creating that, I guess, first level of reprocessing for a number of these materials. We had been shipping them offshore and not really concentrating on what was happening to them once they had gone away. By actually establishing these bans, it creates a market which is being encouraged to process those materials at least to a point where they are recommoditized and can be brought back into the market, whether that be in Australia, given our small manufacturing capacity here versus the amount of material that we import, or as an external market commodity that could be sent out into other jurisdictions that are seeking to absorb more recycled and reprocessed content. So they've really set the benchmark, I guess, at that base level from the economy's point of view to create a system where we can capture and recover those materials and at least produce them to a commodity level where we can meet our own needs, and with any of the excess material that we have in our hands, we can then find markets external to Australia that will be able to absorb and use those materials as well. There are also a number of other elements in the plastic plan around things like the phase out of some what they're calling problematic and unnecessary plastic packaging materials, things like fragmentable plastics. We've seen a lot of innovation in this space over the last few years, and we've seen a lot of things like biodegradables and oxo-biodegradables, things that are actually created with an additive component that make them break down more rapidly. The problem is that a lot of these materials are ending up in single-use plastic applications, and as a result, they're ending up in the litter and waste streams because of the fact that they're common to those pathways. So unfortunately, they also end up in our environment and also are being consumed by our marine life in the waterways and the oceans and causing problems in that space. So phase outs for that material have been allocated. We've also looked at expanded polystyrene. Now, while this is a particularly recyclable material, the problem is that the volumes of material coming through the Australian market are very small. And there is not the volume that will enable efficient reprocessing of that material. So very few businesses are seeking to recover that material and reprocess it. And as a result of that, it becomes a very expensive process. And we're seeing a better pathway in actually phasing out those materials. APCO's working closely with the government at the moment to create a roadmap for how that phase out will occur. And we should have more information for the market in the next little while. We're just in the last stages of that process. We're also looking at materials like PVC, and PVC in packaging labels has been identified as particularly problematic because of the fact that it gets into the waste streams with a lot of very recyclable plastics and can contaminate those streams and reduce the quality of the material that is actually being recovered because of the fact that it has chlorinated materials in there, and it causes all sorts of issues when they're going through reprocessing. So phasing that material out is another target area. We have areas that are using PVC, such as healthcare uses a lot in terms of IV bags and those sorts of materials. They are creating their own recovery processes to make sure that that material can be captured. And in that case, they are acceptable in the marketplace because they have a destination to go to. So it's an interesting level of complexity there. The other side of things that we're looking at as well is in terms of informing consumers particularly, but also expansion out into broader labelling applications through the mandate of the Australasian Recycling Label, which is an APCO service that is provided to our members, and more and more brand owners are using this to actually identify on packaging what the correct disposal behaviour is for householders. So this is actually a mandate that the government's very keen to see by 2023, not necessarily to achieve the packaging targets in that shorter space of time, but really to actually start cleaning up the waste streams more efficiently, so that materials that are going through that commingled household recycling bin are actually materials that can be recycled and recovered, rather than having unrecyclable materials going in there and causing more of a burden to the recovery and reprocessing system than might otherwise be the case. So by actually creating that labelling and applying it, particularly in that supermarket products kind of context, we start to hit the behaviour change that will actually improve the quality of the streams that are coming through resource recovery systems, and actually be able to improve the efficiency of the businesses that are actually operating in that space as well. So it has a multi-pronged approach in terms of delivering positive outcomes there. We're also, of course, responsible under the Plastics Plan for the delivery of the national packaging targets, which I'll talk a little bit more about. And we're also seeing work happening in the space around things like microfiber pollution, which is coming a lot from synthetic fibres and textiles that we're seeing coming through our hands as consumers as well. So it's a really comprehensive plan, and it's really certainly driving, I think, the way that the industry is looking at addressing a lot of these issues that they're facing at the moment. So the next question is, where does APCO fit into this? We are actually, we're a voluntary not-for-profit product stewardship organisation. So that's a big mouthful of terminology there. In terms of the National Environment Protection Measure, which I mentioned before, the measure actually provides two pathways for businesses to meet their compliance obligations. One of those pathways is to report to individual state and territory environment agencies that are responsible for what we call that co-regulatory model. Commonwealth sets the agenda, states and territories manage the actual implementation, because they hold responsibility for waste and waste management at that level. If you are reporting in that way, you are required to report into every state and territory jurisdiction in which you sell your products, and you are then submitting those reports through your headquartered state. So if you operate in New South Wales, but you sell into all the other states and territories around Australia, you need to report for each of those states and territories via your agency in New South Wales, which is the EPA. So that can be quite an onerous task. To make that process a little bit easier, the government set up what has become known as the Australian Packaging Covenant. And the covenant is effectively a voluntary approach to meeting those compliance obligations. So our role as an organisation is primarily to support members in addressing and meeting the obligations that exist underneath the National Environment Protection Measure. Now, that's one of the things that we do, but as an organisation, we also do a lot more. And part of that role that we fulfil is actually creating, I guess, the knowledge and the understanding for industry as to how to make the changes that they need to make in order to improve the outcomes that are emerging as a result of their use of packaging in the marketplace. So we sit in that space where members come to us, they become signatories to the covenant, which is effectively an agreement between business and government. And we sit in that secretariat kind of administrative space in the middle, where we manage that relationship and support both sides of the equation to drive not only the agendas from the government perspective, but also the delivery from the brand owner and packaging industry perspective. So quite kind of unique in that respect, in that we're not really government, but we're not an industry association, but we are absolutely here to deliver on the national regulatory frameworks that exist for all people putting packaging into the Australian marketplace. When I talk about packaging, I would also just mention that we look at the 4 key materials, and in fact, it's expanding now into other areas as well as a result of innovation. But the key materials are, of course, plastic, glass, fibre and cardboard, and metals. They are the key areas that we work with, because they are the key materials that are used in packaging across not only Australia, but the world. We are also seeing increasing movement into alternative materials. We're seeing emergence of things like wood packaging, which we're now starting to track as well. But we're also seeing other things such as reuse models starting to come into play a lot more. And this is becoming more widespread across different sectors as we progress through in terms of trying to deliver against these targets. So I think you'll start to see a lot more of those sorts of options becoming available, particularly in terms of that logistics and distribution packaging in those sorts of areas as well. Now, the regulation has just recently been under a review process. It was originally crystallised in 2011, so we had a 10-year review. On the back of that, a number of recommendations have been put forward, not necessarily to change the way that APCO operates, but to increase the robustness of the regulatory regime outside of the APCO pathway. In the past, there has been I guess a lack of enforcement and maintenance of that process outside of the covenant. So I think government has really understood that the recommendations from industry are that we need to bring both sides up to a level playing field, so that all members, all businesses across the marketplace are really delivering on the same objectives, regardless of the pathway that they choose to follow. So we're likely to see a lot of change around that in the next little while. Certainly, we have an election in the wind, so we are waiting with bated breath to see what the outcome of that is. But we feel that regardless of what the outcome will be, the acknowledgement is that we need to do more work in this space to improve outcomes. So we anticipate that we will see some movement in that space, regardless of who ends up in power in the next few months' time. For those of you who are interested in understanding a little bit more about what that relationship is between APCO and the state and territory entities, I've just popped a number of different bits of information there based on the states and territories and the agencies that are responsible for that regulatory framework in those jurisdictions. There are also some webinars that we actually did last year with the various agencies that we have links up there for. And if you're interested in that in terms of your own state context, please jump onto those sites and have a little look. I believe Marie will be sharing these slides after the presentation today, so you'll have access to all those links. Now, in terms of the work that APCO does, we focus very much in 4 areas. Packaging design is probably the key and the area that we have most influence, because most of the members that join APCO are brand owners who are looking at putting packaging into the marketplace or shifting the packaging that they're currently using. We also work in the system space to look at collection and recovery. We look at education through labelling and also through the work that we do with industry to try and inform them as to the landscape that they're operating in, some of the limitations and complexities associated with that, and I guess empowering them to actually make valid decisions. So these are businesses like yours who are challenged by some of these questions. We certainly provide that education framework in which people can understand not just the materials and the packaging formats, but also, I guess, the logistics and the conditions in the Australian marketplace for recovery and reprocessing, and ultimately the end use of those recovered recycled materials. And we focus very much in a circularity space. Everybody's talking about circular economics at the moment, the idea that these resources need to stay in the system. We've been working very much in that linear space where you take it, you make it, and then you throw it away at the end. What we're trying to do is create a circular model for these materials that keeps them at a high level, i.e. if they were packaging, they stay as packaging and they stay in the system for as long as possible. So back in 2020, it seems like a much longer time ago, but I think the pandemic slightly shifted our perception of time over the last couple of years. But in 2020, we released our packaging future. And underneath our packaging future, there were 3 key areas which align very much with those key areas I just mentioned, and some very clear strategies underneath each of those outcomes to try and drive towards the targets that we are working towards. As you can see on the right-hand side of that graphic, we have the targets aligned with the various strategies, and you can see what the impact of those particular areas will have on delivering on those targets. To do that work as an organisation, we are quite small. I don't mean to be modest, but I feel we punch above our weight a lot. There are only about 30 people in the organisation, but considering the work that we do in this space, I'm always very impressed by the teams that sit behind and the amount of information and knowledge that they help to support our members with. So it's a fantastic collaborative space in this respect, but we can't do this on our own. Ultimately, it is the business owners and the businesses themselves that have to make their decisions as to how they will progress in this space, and we sit there in a supportive context. We work within what's called the collective impact model, and that model effectively sits us as a backbone organisation in the centre of what we call a packaging value chain. We work together with brand owners, but we also engage with all the different players around that circle and make sure that they can all come to the table to have a very often dynamic conversation around the challenges that are being faced. And it is always surprising to see people who are effectively on opposite sides of the packaging value chain suddenly starting to understand what the barriers are from different people's perspectives, and the creativity that comes from that is quite incredible. We work towards a common agenda, which of course is the national packaging targets. And because of the fact that we are focused in on those, we actually undertake activities that reinforce one another right across that stakeholder audience. So that target is always in front of mind with the stakeholders that we engage with. We're also in a position where we are continuously communicating this information out. So whether it be through our own communications teams and the messaging that's going out to our members and to our stakeholders, or whether it's things like messaging around labelling on pack for consumers to be aware of disposal instructions and improve their behaviour through that educational element as well. So constantly pushing that information out there to make sure that people are seeing the work that's being done and actually learning and utilising that knowledge to make their own decisions. And of course, we measure that. We have put out tracking reports over the last 3 years to look at how we're going towards 2025, and the signals are pointing in the right direction. But when I talk about that packaging value chain, I guess that slide on screen at the moment shows you the level of complexity that we're talking about when we talk about material circularity. In a packaging context, there are very many players in that chain. But what we as an organisation try to do is bring all of those voices together and have that conversation that helps to identify what the solutions may be. Some of you may be aware of a recent project that was delivered by Nestlé in collaboration with a number of different participants around that packaging value chain. As you can see, that the graphic on screen there identifies similarly the sorts of participants that were required in order to create that project. And what happened there was that there was a collaboration born of a visit that was facilitated by APCO to a very high-spec material recovery facility and a chemical recycling facility up on the Central Coast here in New South Wales. One of our board members happened to be from Nestlé, and after a day out with us, went back to her desk and came up with an idea for how to try and prove that this could be done for some of the Nestlé packaging materials. The result was that massive collaboration of so many different organisations that really needed to be there along the entire value chain in order to capture the materials, to get them to reprocessing, to turn them into new materials that could be put back into packaging, and ultimately to produce that recycled Kit Kat wrapper. If I was sitting at home at my office desk, I would have one to show you, but I haven't brought it with me, unfortunately. They do exist though. I've eaten many of them, and I still have one that I'm managing to not eat, sitting there as an example. So it is a real thing, and it is really starting to shift the dial on how we are actually doing these collaborative projects. There are a number of others that are happening. Cleanaway, Acai, and Pact Group opened a fantastic plant down in Albury Wodonga this week, looking at trying to actually improve the volume of recycled PET that can be manufactured back into beverage containers here in the Australian marketplace. Up until recently, we've actually been importing a lot of that material because we couldn't get enough of it here on shore. So these are the sorts of collaborations that are starting to build out of this kind of approach that we're taking, and it's really starting to hit some of those more challenging areas and deal with some of those issues that are not necessarily as easy to deal with as we might have hoped they would be. So in terms of the national packaging targets, I'll just take you through a little bit about how we're tracking towards those at the moment, and that you see where we're up to. Back in November last year, we published an interim report called the Collective Impact Report to really look at exactly what was happening. That report was underpinned by 2 other pieces of material, one of which is the annual packaging consumption and recycling data report, which really identifies exactly what the flows of materials have been. We've been doing this since 2017-18, so we've got 3 years worth of data. Prior to that, this information wasn't being collated. So it's relatively new to the market, even being able to understand exactly what is flowing through and where it's going. So that's a really good report to dip into to understand a little bit more about what those nuances are by material. I think one of the key things that came out of that, though, is that ultimately, if we had been capturing a lot of that material that was not being recovered, we would actually be saving ourselves enormous amounts in terms of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and also we're losing a lot of material value by just allowing these materials to end up in landfill. So if we can capture those better, we can keep that value in the market for longer, and the economics of it really do start to stack up in terms of the viability of creating these systems. So in terms of how we're tracking against the last few years' results, we have those 4 targets there. The top one being 100% of packaging will be recyclable, reusable, or compostable by 2025. This is really the key target. If we can achieve that, all the other things will fall out from underneath that more easily. If everything that's going into the system is actually up to speed in terms of that 100% target, being able to recover that material and reprocess it is going to be much more feasible, viable, and economically accessible for businesses. In terms of that flow, I mentioned that we're starting to see a lot of innovation and movement around materials in the marketplace. There are new materials coming in, and we're seeing a lot of creativity going on in that space, which is partly responsible for that slight shift backwards in this latest accounted year. But on the whole, we are moving in the right direction there, and it's really just, I think, a case of this is an issue that's still relatively new for a lot of businesses, and a lot of people are actually exploring what that will look like for their own requirements. And as a result, we're seeing a bit of fluctuation around that. The fact that we've got 14% in the marketplace that needs work is something that we as an organisation are now honing in on very carefully to understand exactly what that composition is, where the problems lie, and what we can actually do to deliver the outcomes we're after. The second target of 70% plastic packaging being recycled or composted by 2025, as you can see, it's a plastic-specific target. We know that plastics is our problem area. And as you can see from the figures on screen there, they're not great in terms of achieving that 70%. We have a lot of work to do in that space, and I'll talk a little bit more about what we're aiming at in that area in a few moments. But suffice to say, it's certainly the problem child. Plastics is the area that is really causing us a few headaches, and I guess making us think very creatively about how we approach this. The 50% recycled content target. When we first set about this work in, I think it was 2016 to 2017, we set a target of 30%. That first year's accounting that we did in terms of those material flows pleasantly showed us that in actual fact, we'd already met that target. We were already sitting at 35%. And as a result of some industry consultation on the back of that, we felt comfortable that we could revise that upwards to 50%. It certainly is being carried by some of the more recyclable materials such as glass, metals, and fibre packaging. But we're even starting to see movements in the plastics direction that are bolstering and reinforcing that. We have a few areas that we need to work on around things like food contact, but it's moving in the right direction, and that's a very positive sign. The fourth of them is the phase out of problematic and unnecessary single-use plastic packaging. I mentioned some of those materials that have been earmarked by government in terms of what we need to get rid of. We're working very closely, particularly around things like as I mentioned, the EPS roadmap will be coming out soon. We are looking at things like PFAS in fibre packaging as well. That's another area that needs to be addressed. There's a whole bunch of them, and we've got some resources up on the APCO website that create an action plan for those materials that have been pulled out and identified as being problematic and unnecessary. So I encourage people to have a look at those resources as well. So in terms of the losses in the packaging system, last year we had about 6.3 million tonnes of packaging put on the marketplace. 14% of that was not recyclable by design, i.e. it had problems with the composition of materials. It had components that were unrecoverable through existing recovery systems. There are a whole bunch of reasons that this material was not being recyclable and not being deemed recyclable, and that is, as I said, somewhere that we're really going to focus on over the next couple of years. We also have some challenges in terms of things like business-to-business packaging, distribution packaging, things like strapping around pallets and pallet wrap and those sorts of areas that are being created with materials that are not necessarily recyclable. Lots of PVC blends in those sorts of areas, so some work to be done in that sort of space. So once we get through that 14% that we can't actually recycle, that leaves us with about 5.4 million tonnes on the market that is actually recyclable but is not being collected. And part of this is, again, problems with business-to-business packaging that is not being captured or recovered or separated on site, suitable for recovery processes. It's materials that are just not ending up in the right place, people putting them in the wrong bin, and they're just going to the wrong destination. So there's an area there that we need to look at in terms of how we fill some of those gaps. We're certainly looking in that business-to-business element at the moment and looking at how we can actually set up processes and systems that will accommodate that more effectively. In terms of the packaging that is being collected, some of it's being lost in the recycling process. So it's materials ending up in the wrong stream, or materials that aren't identifiable by the automated systems that we've got, and the lack of manual sortation is causing problems in those sorts of spaces. So when we look at all those cascading impacts, we end up with around about 50% of our materials actually being recycled in the marketplace here. So it's not too bad a rate, but we need to push that up significantly. And if we start to look at it by the particular materials, you can see exactly where the gaps are there. For example, glass packaging, pretty much 100% recyclable. We don't have problems with the glass packaging at all. We're seeing a few things around things like shrink labeling and on pack and those sorts of things that are causing a few problems, but people are tending to move away from those because there is a recognition that they're problematic in the system. As you can see there, in the middle of all that is plastic, and plastic continues to be a bit of a challenge. In terms of the 70% recycled target for plastic, you can see we have very different conditions going on between flexibles and rigids. Generally, rigids are much more easily recyclable based on predominantly just the fact that they have a three-dimensional form. When we look at flexible plastics, we can't put them through our curbside systems at the moment because they cause problems in our automated sortation systems. So we're having to find alternative destinations for those materials. There's also a lot of flexible plastic that goes through business to business. It's the kind of stuff that is wrapped around your pallets or covering, some of your products that are being shipped in large scale products that are being shipped as well. So we're not capturing that material particularly well. It's also not necessarily recyclable based on composition. So some of those areas need to be addressed. But as you can see, there is quite a difference between the rigids and the flexibles there. So a lot of work to be done. In terms of Australian capacity, we are improving that at a rate of knots. As I mentioned, there was a plant just opened down in Albury-Wodonga for rPET. There's a lot of stuff in the planning pipeline at the moment around not only mechanical recycling pathways, but also chemical and advanced recycling, which is going to be, we feel, a pathway for a lot of those challenging flexible plastics, because they are difficult in mechanical systems, but the chemical recycling technology that's emerging at the moment is really providing us a good opportunity to get those materials processed and take them back to a very base level, which means we can build them back up into any kind of packaging. So that's really offering some great opportunities, we feel, there. In terms of the recycled content side of things, as I mentioned, you can see there, ultimately, it is materials such as fibre and glass and metals that are doing very well. To try and drive that a little bit harder within the APCO context, we've actually established some resin-specific targets, because we know that things like PET packaging is much easier to recycle in the Australian marketplace. We have problems with things like HDPE packaging based on contamination rates and application in food grade settings. Some of those things need to be worked on. So as a result of that, we've actually created slightly different targets for each based on some of the challenges that we faced, but also based on the volume of those materials in the marketplace. rPET particularly is, in the beverage context, one of the most widely used recycled polymers in the marketplace, not just here, but overseas as well. So we can aim for a higher level there. So it is the plastic space that really is causing us the challenges, I think, and that's one of the things that we're really working towards, how we address that more effectively. In terms of the phase out side of things, we've seen an enormous shift as a result of a very simple set of bans around shopping bags. Somebody described it to me the other day as a gateway elimination pathway using shopping bags. It's really something quite simple. It's moved people into a reusable mindset, because we're starting to think about taking our shopping bags back to the store. Now we're also starting to think about taking our soft plastics back to the store because, well, I've got to take my bag, so I might as well stick the soft plastics in the bag and drop them off when I get to the supermarket. So it's really, I think, set a scene that is starting to build at the consumer level more confidence in terms of how they return their materials, the opportunity to return their materials in the first place, but also to consider what they might not need when it comes to packaging. I think we're seeing people moving away from things like barrier bags and those sorts of elements in a supermarket context to not necessarily even using those materials at all anymore. So that's had a significant impact on the consumer mindset, and we're starting to see that filter into other areas as well. So there are positive signs there too. So I guess the last thing I really just wanted to touch on for you was a little around the packaging innovation side of things. We are very much encouraging people to innovate and think creatively. I always say start not necessarily thinking outside the box, but start with the box. There's a lot that can be done with distribution packaging, particularly, especially if you're using carton boards and things like that. There are very high recycled contents that can be put into those materials, and there are really good circular models that exist for some of those distribution materials that people are using. We're also looking at reuse systems in that space. So looking at the global distribution systems that businesses like CHEP and Brambles use for pallets that are reusable, for we're looking at containers as another area that we can drive into. But these kind of I guess stimulate creative thought around how you might be able to apply reuse to your own packaging and the choices that you're making there. Is it something that you could be doing with your customers to try and drive that reuse sort of model and step up the waste hierarchy? In terms of starting that journey, the first place we always recommend people to have a look, and this is publicly available to anybody, whether you're an APCO member or not, our sustainable packaging guidelines. They really set 10 key pillars that people should be thinking about as to how to address packaging sustainability. It's not just about the materials. It's also about things like accessibility to product. Are people going to have to get scissors out of the drawer in order to get into your packaging? Does that cause problems? Is that going to lead to additional waste because they may throw a product away because they can't get into it easily? It's those sorts of elements that really come into that broader, I guess, holistic design that we need people to be thinking about when we're talking about packaging circularity. We also have a labelling program, as I mentioned, which we deliver to our members in partnership with Planet Arc and Prep Design. It's a two-part system which allows you to look at the design of your packaging and evaluate it for recyclability within the Australian marketplace. It looks at material composition, it looks at recoverability, and it looks at end markets for the material once it has been recovered. And then that allows you to translate the findings of the evaluation into a label that can be placed on pack. At the moment, this is very much calibrated to consumers and household recycling, but we are currently looking at how we can expand that out into other areas. We're also looking to complement that with the recycled content labelling program and an underpinning traceability standard so that people who want to tell their consumers and their customers how much recycled content they're putting into their packaging to drive that circularity, this will start to enable them to do that and do that in such a way that it's completely transparent to the consumer, that it can be tracked through the system to validate claims and avoid any accusations around greenwashing and things like that. So there's a whole complex system there that is evolving around the labelling side of things. And we're also moving into a reuse label, which is the next sort of pinnacle step in terms of pushing up the waste hierarchy there. So lots happening in that space. As I said, we've also got an awful lot of resources available to anybody that would like to look at them. These are publicly available. There are a number of things that are member only on our website, but in terms of that high level information, jump on there and have a little look. There are a number of resources there that are available to anybody. We just want people moving in the right direction there, so we don't have any restriction to accessing a lot of those documents. So it's a good place to start and see what's available and to start thinking in that space. The other thing that is, of course, of interest at the moment around the plastic side of things is we are also host to the Australia, New Zealand and Pacific Islands Plastics Pact, which is part of the global network that was originally set up with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and RAP in the UK and has actually expanded quite a way across the world now. We are the 10th pact and we are the second regional pact, so we cover multiple territories, but we're looking at how we can work right across the Pacific area, particularly in the plastic space, to improve the recovery, to improve the flow of materials, and to improve that circularity in areas that are quite challenged, I guess, in terms of the impact that plastics are having, certainly out in the islands and some of those areas that are very vulnerable in this space. So a lot of work being done there. Folks, I am not going to fill you with too much more information. I guess I would just say, get in touch, get active, start thinking about this. If you have questions, we're here. APCO just wants to support people to move in the right direction in this space. So if you would like to talk a little bit about any of these issues or things that I've discussed today, we are here and ready to support you in whatever way we possibly can. So I'd encourage you to get in touch and have a chat about what we can do for you. So I guess that's it, Marie. I am just looking to see if there are any questions in the Q&A box there.
So first one there is from Jason, who's asking, does APCO cover Australian only generated packaging, or does it include imported packaging as well?
Great question, Jason. Now, it covers any packaging that is put onto the Australian marketplace. So if you are a brand owner manufacturing in Australia, the responsibility lies with you as the company that puts the product or packaging material into the marketplace. If you are an importer of product, the import point is the point of responsibility in the Australian marketplace as well. So the business that is located here in Australia is the one that is responsible for meeting the compliance obligations. So yes, we cover everything. It's just about whether or not that is actually a brand owner's own product, or whether it is something that they're bringing into the market from outside.
Well, I think we might wrap things up there, Jayne. Everyone, that does bring us, of course, to the end of today's presentation. So first of all, I just want to thank everyone who registered and attended today's webinar, and of course a special thanks to Jayne for such a great presentation today. So thank you very much. As I said, the recording will be made available, and I'll send through an email as soon as that does become available for you guys to view. If you want to register or view any of AIRAH's other upcoming Streamline or Technology Talk sessions, you could do so via the AIRAH website, which is airah.org.au/webinars. So thank you all again. Thank you, Jayne. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to get in touch.
Absolutely. Thank you, Marie. Thanks for organising.
Not a worries. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.